This series of videos sets out an energy markets business ontology. It examines the things you will need to know to make sense of the energy markets in Great Britain.
I'm going to be answering three questions. Why is an ontology needed? What is an ontology? And how has the energy markets business ontology been built? Starting with the first of these, why is an ontology needed? So I'm going to go through these 6 reasons that come to mind. The first thing is that we need to unpack the complexity in industry systems and documentation. Now, ontologies do that in a number of ways. I hope that will become apparent as we go through these videos. Secondly, ontologies provide a really sound basis for data management and governance. Now, there's a strong reason for that, and it's to do with the interconnectedness that we're experiencing in so many business activities that we are involved in. We're ever more interconnected, and the time when we could produce an isolated output or outcome and just tailor the data as necessary to produce that output or outcome, those days are past. People are looking for broad data integration, sharing of data across organizations and externally to the organization. We're looking to integrate with our master data, reference data. And I think that brings us on to the next reason, really, the digital transformation and data centricity. So enterprise architecture has been mainly concerned with applications and processes, and the tool sets around enterprise architecture that I've been using and many others have are very much oriented around applications, processes, capabilities, etc. And yet organizations are striving for digital transformation and data centricity. I think we all know the rationale for that. I'm not going to go through it, but if that's something we're striving for, then they will be more successful if our data and our terms are better understood and better instituted into our business and our documentation. So fourthly, we need to tackle reductionism in data definition. So what do I mean by that? Well, relational database technology and continuing drive for economic efficiency have led to us reducing our data definitions to what is required to produce point solutions, specific outcomes. And that's all been accentuated with a building of technical debt, again, to provide economic and efficient outcomes, but often very tactical. And there's little criticism of that from a tactical perspective, but if we do want to achieve these wider benefits of data centricity, digital transformation, and broad data integration, we need to move further than that. So that moves us on to the fact that ontology is now mature and proven. So when we're asking why ontology is needed, I think it's important to recognize that ontology is something that is of proven benefit in many business contexts. An example would, for instance, would be the financial industry business ontology, FIBO. And going slightly more into the academic field, the open biological and biomedical ontologies. I would invite you to chase down those two references, and you'll find that ontology has been used extensively and gained huge benefits. I think the last thing to say is that ontology is now attainable. Creation is straightforward. It's possible to base business ontologies upon upper ontologies, which I'll talk about when we go through what ontology is. Upper ontologies such as basic formal ontology and gist. There's also software available, and again, we'll talk through that later in this video.
So, returning to our three questions, looking at the second of those, what is an ontology? So this is quite an involved, it's quite an extensive subject, it's quite an involved question. I'm going to use 7 points to illustrate what an ontology is. This is very much a personal view of what I've found is significant to ontology as is relevant to the energy markets business ontology. So what is an ontology? First of all, when we talk about an ontology, this is about an application of ontology, an applied ontology. It's not academic, it is practical. In this instance, we're applying it to a business context. So ontology as a discipline relates to the study of existence. And that can lead us into some very theoretical discussions. We're not interested in those here. We're looking for a practical way of taking forward our understanding of a business domain. So ours is very much a practical business application of ontology as a wider subject. I think it's important then to realize that ontology is not just a way of thinking about existence. There needs to be some structure in the way that that thinking takes place. And so in a business context, we need to introduce some rigor. And typically the way that we do that is introducing standards. And the standards that you'll see that have been used for this ontology are RDF, which I think you're probably all familiar with, and the web ontology language, OWL. It's very important then to assert that the ontology that we're creating is a representation of reality. We're not using terms or data as a means to produce an isolated output or outcome. We're not engineering some system or some documentation. The ontology and the things within it must represent reality as we perceive it to be, in all of its richness. So I think moving on from those things, having structure and basing ontologies on reality leads us to the next point, that because we've got that structure and the foundation in reality, we can share terms and data more widely with our communities in which we work without confusion, and all know that we're on the same page. Now that is very important in terms of enabling us to build what we're often challenged with in our work, is when we enter into a new program of work, we end up having to demolish some of what was there previously and rebuild. And ontology should provide us with a much more stable environment that we can continuously build. So what's an ontology about? Well, things, concepts, terms, entities, classes, it's about all of these things, really. There are slight subtleties in what all of those things mean. And as we dig further into the ontology, I hope that will become apparent. I think the one thing that it is worth saying is that an ontology is not a thesaurus. It is not something that relies on a language. And in that sense, the things that are defined in an ontology can be related to multiple languages. And indeed, ontologies have been used for that very purpose of translation. So moving on from the things within the ontology, we're also interested in the relations between those things. And those relations aren't simply the associations that we are used to from the traditional background in relational data models. Just putting up a diagram to explain that. So this is an example taken from GIST, the upper ontology, which we'll talk about later. And moving from left to right, this defines an artifact. Now, an artifact is something made by a human being. A building is in the sense that we all understand it as a domestic dwelling or a commercial construction, etc. And clearly, a building is a artifact because buildings are human-made constructions. Equally, content. So content as in the content of a document or the content of an image or the content of a paper. This is also a man-made thing, a human-made thing. So consequently, it also is a artifact. And you can see here on the relationships that we've used using the traditional arrows that those relationships are ISO relationships to artifact, and they are directional. But it's also worth moving down that a little bit further. So an address is a form of content, and a building address is a form of address. So what a taxonomy enables us to do is build this hierarchy of things that are increasingly specialized as we move down the hierarchy. But we can see that a building address is not a building. That is not a taxonomic relationship. And the relationship actually here is the street address of, so that the building address is the street address of a building. And so that gives just a taste of the relations that we expect to see in a ontology, taxonomic and other relationships. Lastly, it's worthwhile talking about upper and lower ontologies. Now, there is some debate in the community as to this division, but it is useful, in my view, for business to take this on board by employing an upper ontology. We end up distancing ourselves from some of the more academic discussions that need to take place to arrive at the starting point for an ontology. It's almost like putting a underpinning standard into the construction of our ontology. And the upper ontologies have become increasingly successful. Clearly, basic formal ontology had a huge impact. The ontology that we've chosen to base the energy markets business ontology on is GIST. GIST, as in the gist of something, it's a ontology that's produced by Semantic Arts. We'll talk about it in more detail in a minute. But building on that upper ontology, we can then construct our domain ontologies, our business ontologies. And that is what we've done with the energy markets business ontology. Moving on to the third of our questions, how has the energy markets business ontology been built? Well, I'd like to go through these 6 points. So it's been built using Protégé. That's a very widely used open source ontology editor. It can be downloaded and run on a variety of platforms, the desktop application. It's very easy to use, and I would heartily recommend it as a good place to start if you're delving into ontology. So within Protégé, you can employ a number of standards to upon which to base your ontology. So clearly, the resource description framework, subject, predicate, object, something we're very familiar with. The web ontology language OWL, and the SCOS, the Simple Knowledge Organization Scheme. Those are all things that are used within Protégé to help structure the ontology. There's some additional plugin software that can be used with Protégé to do a number of things. One of the things that we've used is the visualization, and there are actually two packages that are needed for that. There's the OWL visualization plugin, and the graph visualization software needs that to run. So the diagrams that you'll see both in this video and on GitHub, you'll see are courtesy of that software. So the energy markets business ontology is unashamedly built on the upper ontology called GIST. That it's a minimalist upper ontology developed by Semantic Arts. It has particular relevance to our context in that it's been designed for us to easily approach it and employ it as business ontologists. So if you want to find the energy market business ontology, it's held on the GitHub repository. The link is given there. It's possible from there to download the files into Protégé or into your own ontology editor and really have a good browse through the ontology and try some scenarios yourself and try and extend the ontology. Clearly, we're very interested in your thoughts on that repository, and there are opportunities through GitHub to raise issues, make pull requests, etc., with that repository. And a key thing, in my view, for the energy markets business ontology is it's open and free under the Creative Commons license. So clearly that places certain constraints if you want to reuse it, in that there's a certain constraint of needing to use a similar license if this ontology has been used in derivative products. But I think it's really important that, in my view, this is open and free, in that it needs to gain some momentum. And one of the ways that ontologies have gained momentum in so many other areas of business has been to create them as open and with open and free licensing. And really that is something we feel quite strongly about. We'd like to see that continued in the industry. And we hope that is something that perhaps might start to be taken on board with some of the other areas in industry as a means of just moving the industry on into this new world where we all need to be able to integrate our data in lots of different contexts and lots of different ways. So we've answered those three questions. Why is an ontology needed? What is an ontology? How has the energy markets business ontology been built? In the next video, we'll be looking in more detail at the content of the ontology. So how it's been structured, what are the things within the ontology, what are the relations within the ontology, and what they mean and what their significance are, and some of the decisions that were made in the process of building that ontology. Thank you.